Alright, we are overclocking an FX 6300 on an AsRock Extreme 3 Pro to about 5 GHz, and I also overclocked my RAM, but that's not important for now. And the first thing you would want to do for that is set everything to your default settings, voltage and frequency. You can let your fan curves on how much you like them. I put them to just like manual settings so they don't ramp up that hard. And everything else is at auto and default settings, and we do that first, so we find out our default voltage, and we save and exit to Windows. And within Windows, what you would want to do is download an app like CPU-C that can display your current voltage of your CPU, and also a program like Prime95 that is used for stress testing your CPU to about 100% all time. And I'm just going to call that up. No, I think it is under Tools. There we have it. You usually use either blend all above or maximum power heat and CPU stress, because maximum heat means we will use maximum voltage. And I'm going to click on OK and read this value here, and it says in and about 1.2 volt all of the time. It goes up to maximum of 1.236 volt for my CPU. It might differ on your CPU because every CPU has slightly different values. So I note that down with the 1.36 maximum and power down my PC. You can obviously let Prime95 run for a longer time to be more sure about your VID. But I already know mine. Okay, so back in BIOS, we go to the OC tweaker, and I already have it in manual mode, and I changed the overclock mode to manual, of course, because we want to set manual values for that. And I think I disabled the spread spectrum because that lowers your ability to like jump around, so the CPU stays at a constant value all the time. And I want to use all of my cores. I obviously will disable turbo core because I want a fixed value. Basically what we do now is we turn off everything automatic and everything that changes our voltage, because we don't want that to ramp up too high and maybe cause an issue. Most important thing is our multiplier. We will change that later to set up a higher frequency. I set this to 2000 because it's 2000 on my system. Depending on your system, this might change. You can also leave it at auto. It's not that big of a change. Change the settings of my RAM to an overclock of 2400 because I have 2133. You don't need to do that. If you don't want to overclock your RAM, then just leave everything at auto. Okay. As we have an AM3 plus CPU, we want to disable the load line calibration as it says. And I'm not going to change anything with the North Bridge voltages or DRAM voltages. Alright. In advanced settings for the CPU, we will disable cool and quiet, so we get more consistent temperatures. We really don't need secure virtual machine for a normal run, so I disable that too. It won't really change anything. And the Core C6 mode, you can let that on too, but I like it to be disabled. And I leave my CPU at thermal throttle so I don't accidentally damage anything, even though I have a big 420mm cooler on there. Alright, first thing we do is we let every of these settings as it is right now. And what you can now do is go into Windows and use these settings and see if your system runs stable. I already know it runs stable, so I will already start overclocking. And I do that by increasing my frequency. And the best thing I would advise you to do is Go by 100 MHz steps, see if your system boots and runs stable with like Geekbench test. That is usually a short test. And if it doesn't run stable, you immediately power off your PC and go back into the BIOS and increase your voltage by an increment. And you really only touch those two values. So for 5 GHz, for example, I got my CPU. Please note that it might vary depending on how good your model of the FX 6300 is. You will need either to have a higher voltage or won't be able to set it that high at all. But I found out my CPU to be stable at 5 GHz with 1.4375 volt. Can even be a lower voltage if I only want to run benchmarks, but for a daily drive I chose a bit more voltage. Given that I have a good cooler, my system can handle that. And we save and exit. Back into Windows, we now see that we have a frequency of around 5 GHz. Of course, not every mainboard gets the 200 MHz bus straight, so these are 5 GHz, just like reads as 4.9999. Sometimes change a little bit around. I can't get my board to stop from turning that much, but it's really small values. Usually not more than a megahertz in difference. When your CPU boosts, it will be at a constant value. And we see we have a slightly higher value than what we set in BIOS, and I found that to be a thing with this main board. So maybe be a bit more careful with putting up your voltage when we open CoreTemp, for example, but then it will show us the voltage that we set in BIOS. It's 1.4375. Yeah, I wouldn't advise you to go over 1.5 volt for a daily drive, because that's just hot for most coolers and it kinda degrades your silicon over time. Only really do that if you want to go for benchmarks or you know that you will throw that CPU out in like a month anyways. Okay, to test if that run is stable, we can open Prime 95 and use the maximum heat and like let it run for 8 hours or a day. Usually if it doesn't crash during that, have a stable overclock. And if it doesn't run stable, you either lower your frequency for an increment or up your voltage by an increment. Okay, and just as a proof, I will start a game now. Also open up MSI to see if the frame rate is constant. And as you can see now, our CPU is running at a maximum temperature of 30 degrees. That's thanks to my massive AIO water cooler. Obviously, if you only run a stock cooler, then you're probably already in flames. But we get a consistent frame rate, so that means we will have a nice gameplay experience now thanks to our overclock. And we are below 60 FPS. That's because I'm using kind of an old GPU on a newer game. But besides that, everything is running fine. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one.